goal of this program is to trace the arc of the evolution of the redwood industry through a century and a half of forest exploitation and degradation toward a new paradigm of restoration and stewardship. Though this evolution has been gradual, it has revolutionary components. It's a lot of ground to cover, so, without further ado, we'll begin at the beginning. For most of its history, logging in the Redwood region is more accurately described as timber mining than forest management. When Euro-Americans first came flooding into California in large numbers during and after the gold rush, Northern California's magnificent coastal redwood forests were virtually intact, stretching from Big Sur to the Oregon border and covering more than 2 million acres. Many of the newcomers failed to strike it rich in gold and turned to harvesting the giant trees to provide lumber for booming development in San Francisco and other places on the West Coast. In the beginning, lumbermen employed axes, saws, and other early methods of bringing trees down, and horses and oxen were then used to extract the timber. Using these relatively primitive techniques, only the most accessible areas of forest were felled. While some areas were cleared of trees completely, in many cases loggers practiced high grading, concentrating on the biggest trees containing the largest quantities of valuable mahogany-colored heartwood, clear, tight-grained, naturally rot-resistant, and leaving many smaller, less valuable trees behind. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, technology improved, allowing more forest to be cut and timber produced in less time. Portable engines called steam donkeys replaced oxen in removing logs from the forest, and narrow-gauge locomotives transported them on to the sawmills. The drive to rebuild after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fires kicked redwood logging into overdrive. Hundreds of logging towns and sawmills cropped up throughout the Redwood Range. Early conservationists took note of the consequences of the logging boom and began efforts to protect rapidly dwindling old growth, founding the Save the Redwoods League in 1918. Their work resulted in the establishment of Prairie Creek, Del Norte Coast, and Jedediah Smith Redwood State Parks, among others. With the advent of chainsaws in the 1930s, the pace of logging took another quantum leap, and the practice of large-scale clear-cutting became prevalent. Replanting or reforestation was rarely done. The last and most intensive burst of logging began after World War II and continued for the next 40 or 50 years. The flood of returning GIs fueled a housing boom, and an army of bulldozers, logging trucks, and loggers descended on what remained of the original redwood forest. The pace of old-growth logging accelerated significantly, and residual forests located closer to mills, railways, and ports that had previously been high-graded were logged out. All this was encouraged by tax law. Between 1946 and 1976, California taxed landowners unless they cut 70% of their standing timber. Extensive clear-cutting, road building, and the use of tractors and bulldozers to skid logs out of the forest caused massive harm to waterways. Soil eroded from cut-over slopes, stream banks, and poorly built logging roads, filling waters with silt. Heavy equipment was used to drag logs out via creeks and streams, stripping away the fallen logs, boulders, and gravel beds that provided fish spawning grounds. Logging debris created log jams that made fish passage difficult. Finally, most of the trees shading waterways were removed, allowing the sun to raise water temperature to levels inhospitable to some fish. The predictable result was that populations of coho and chinook salmon and steelhead trout were decimated. Today, wild river populations of coho salmon are less than 3% of what they once were. Lumber production in the Redwood region peaked at more than 1 billion board feet a year in the 1960s and 70s. By the 90s, the overall volume of redwood production was about half of what it had been in the industry's heyday 20 years before. By the time Redwood National Park was created in 1968, most of the virgin forest on privately owned lands had been logged out. Nearly 90% of the original redwood forest had been cut down. Today, after more than a century and a half of logging, only about 4% of the old growth remains, nearly all of it in parks. But, as anyone who lives in this region knows, redwoods were not eradicated from the unprotected 96%. In some places, forests were permanently replaced by settlements, farms, and ranches, but in many others, second-growth forests grew back. People who do not live around redwoods may think of them as being delicate and slow to grow, but in fact they are one of the more resilient and fast-growing species around. In ideal conditions, a coast redwood can grow up to 10 feet in height annually, although 2 to 3 feet is more common. At 50 years, a redwood can easily be over 100 feet tall with a trunk several feet in diameter, big enough to yield a considerable quantity of lumber. Also, redwoods have an amazing capacity to sprout from the stumps and roots left behind after logging, which means they do not have to be replanted in order for forests to recover. Even though redwood forests can recover relatively quickly and easily, and therefore lend themselves to management, with a few notable exceptions, timber companies preferred to cut and run as long as enough merchantable timber remained. For its part, the state of California was slow to regulate the industry and require some degree of forest management. A state board of forestry was established in 1885, but for many decades it focused almost entirely on fire protection and suppression. California's first Forest Practices Act wasn't passed until 1946, but even then the committees tasked with developing rules for the regulation of logging were mostly made up of owners of timberland in a given region, and proposed rules then had to be approved by a 2/3 vote of all timberland owners. It wasn't until 1973 that a new Forest Practices Act was passed and a comprehensive set of rules instituted. The new FPA required that a timber harvest plan, or THP, be prepared by a registered professional forester for timber harvests on virtually all non-federal lands. New rules have been added since then, but the 1973 FPA remains the basic regulatory framework for timberland management in the Redwood region. The passage of the 1973 FPA was a significant step forward in the evolution of the industry from forest mining to forest management, and were the most stringent in the country at the time. Even so, as enforced by the California Department of Forestry and Fire, which critics accuse of being far too close to industry, a great deal of environmentally damaging logging was subsequently allowed under it. Some of the largest companies operating in the Redwood region continued to hammer their forests, legally. Two flagrant examples in Mendocino and Humboldt counties respectively were Louisiana Pacific and the Pacific Lumber Company. Louisiana Pacific, or LP, was spun out of another timber giant, Georgia Pacific, in 1972 as a result of an antitrust suit. Led by CEO Harry A. Merlo, Jr., LP started out big and soon became even bigger. By 1982, it had 13,000 employees and was operating 110 plants producing a wide variety of wood and paper products in 13 states. A key asset that LP inherited from its parent was more than 230,000 acres of redwood and Douglas fir forest in Mendocino County, along with several sawmills. It wasn't long before CEO Merlo drew criticism for poor treatment of workers and the overharvesting of timber. In the wake of wage cuts, LP engaged in major clashes with labor unions. In the 1980s, seeing that they were losing, the unions even began to make overtures to environmentalists, taking stands against LP's proposed timber harvest plans. One union representative said at the time, quote, "The accelerated cut in Mendocino by LP will have economic impact upon us when LP is finished cutting over their timberlands and we can no longer look to them for jobs and taxes. We submit that they are not managing their property on a sustained yield basis, and we request that all timber harvest plans be reviewed with the effect upon the landowner's sustained yield program as the final determining factor predicating approval or rejection." End quote. In subsequent years, workers, environmentalists, and Mendocino County residents continued to find common cause over the issue of LP's extensive aerial spraying of herbicides, protesting through pickets, protests, and petitions. In the meantime, LP was cutting timber at roughly 3 times the forest's rate of growth. "We need everything that's out there," Merlot infamously told the Press-Democrat in 1989. "We log to infinity because it's out there and because we need it now." By the mid-1990s, little valuable timber remained on LP's lands, and the company was facing numerous protests, including tree sits and blockades of logging roads, and multiple lawsuits accusing them of regulatory violations. Merlot was fired in 1995 after numerous legal convictions and fines. In 1997, LP announced that it would sell all of its California holdings. To get a sense of the level of resource exploitation that LP engaged in before they bailed out, unlogged old-growth redwood forests typically contain 100,000 or more board feet per acre of standing timber. Well-managed industrial forests contain about 40,000 board feet per acre, and the timberlands that LP put up for sale were estimated at 8,000 board feet per acre. An even more dramatic and notorious case of destructive logging that took place under the 1973 Forest Practices Act is that of Pacific Lumber Company, or PALCO. Begun in 1863, PALCO was an anomaly among redwood companies due to its long-standing commitment to sustainable forestry under the tenure of a remarkable family. From 1905 through 1985, PALCO was directed by Simon J. Murphy and his descendants. Over this time, PALCO built several sawmills, including its main facilities in the company town of Scotia, not far south of Eureka, and it extended its holdings to well over 200,000 acres in southern Humboldt County. In 1931, Stanwood Murphy became president. Observing the rapid depletion of quality redwood timber in the region, he departed from the industry standard of clear-cutting and instituted a selective cut system of logging. The company would limit harvesting to a maximum of 70% of the mature trees in a stand, leaving younger trees behind and releasing them for fast growth by exposing them to sunlight. In half a century, they would grow to the point where the stand could be logged again, and so on indefinitely. He also instituted a policy of sustainable yield, never cutting more timber volume than the forest could grow each year. In effect, living off the interest generated by the forest rather than depleting the principal. The company ran under these principles for the next 55 years. PALCO also led the industry in terms of worker treatment, providing affordable housing, a hospital, a school, a generous pension plan, and free life insurance to its employees. In 1975, a number of years after Stan Murphy had stepped down, PALCO went public and was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. In the early 80s, PALCO was free of debt and was generating after-tax annual profits in excess of $40 million, below the industry average but enough to keep the company healthy. While their rivals had long since been reduced to logging relatively low-quality second and third growth, PALCO had the largest loggable inventory of old-growth timber, 70% of what remained outside of parks, and a corner on the market for the top grades of redwood lumber. It's estimated that at that time, PALCO was sitting on $1.8 billion worth of timber. But these assets were undervalued on PALCO's balance sheet, and this, combined with relatively low profits, resulted in a share price that did not reflect the company's true worth. This made it an ideal target for takeover in an era where predatory acquisitions and leveraged buyouts were all the rage. In 1985, a Texan corporate raider named Charles Hurwitz bought PALCO with the help of $800 million in high-interest debt, borrowed from the so-called Pope of junk bonds, Michael Milken, and incorporated it into his own company, Maxam Inc. $800 million was a lot of debt, but Hurwitz had just acquired nearly $2 billion in assets, and to pay the interest he had to liquidate them, fast. First he sold off PALCO's San Francisco headquarters and raided the company pension fund. But by far and away PALCO's greatest asset was old-growth redwood timber, and in short order the rate of harvest was doubled, if not trebled, and the mill was put on double shifts. Stands of 1,000-year-old trees were being clear-cut at a speed and scale never seen before. Before long, environmentalists took note of the destruction and began to organize resistance under the banner of the radical environmental group Earth First. Led by charismatic firebrands like Darrell Cherney and Judy Berry, forest activists began holding rallies, blockades, and tree sits. As media attention increased, protesters were drawn to Humboldt County from around the country. In 1990, Earth First sought to turn the fight against Palco into an environmentalist cause célèbre, planning a summer of protests, rallies, guerrilla theater, and direct actions. A Redwood summer named after the Freedom Summer of the civil rights movement of the early 1960s. Palco fought back, rallying the support of its employees, timber-dependent communities, local media, businesses, and law enforcement. The community polarized between loggers and hippies, and things began to get violent. In May 1990, on the eve of Redwood summer, Cherney and Berry were driving in Oakland when a pipe bomb went off in their car, seriously injuring both of them. The FBI initially accused them of having planted the bomb themselves, but the evidence indicated otherwise and the charges were eventually dropped. No other suspects were ever charged. At the center of the conflict was the largest tract of intact virgin redwood forest remaining on Palco lands, which the environmentalists had named Headwaters Forest. In the mid-90s, the government stepped in and Headwaters' 7,500 acres was protected at a cost to the taxpayers of $480 million. But Palco would continue to aggressively log the remaining timberlands, and so protests continued. In 1998, Julia Butterfly Hill climbed a 200-foot redwood called Luna and stayed there for 2 years, breaking the record for a tree sit and drawing worldwide attention to the war in the Redwoods. Later that year, Palco itself made history when it became the first logging company in California to lose its license, having racked up more than 300 violations of the Forest Practices Act in the previous 3 years. Palco regained its license the following year and continued logging. Less than 10 years later, in 2007, the company went bankrupt, leaving a legacy of hundreds of thousands of acres of badly cut-over forest, soil erosion from hillside clear-cuts and hundreds of miles of logging roads, degraded waterways, and festering anger in the community. Given what happened with LP and Palco, the decade straddling the turn of the century can be seen as the time period when, after nearly a century and a half of plunder, things finally hit bottom. But in retrospect, this period was also the turning point when, through a combination of necessity and a shift in the zeitgeist, the redwood industry and region began to transition from forest exploitation to stewardship. The first half of the 90s witnessed a grassroots convergence around the challenging question of how to create a new paradigm of ecological forestry in the Redwood region. North Coast foresters, environmental activists, landowners, loggers, natural resource scientists, and others shared a vision that a body of management guidelines could be assembled that would enable landowners to harvest timber while protecting and restoring the forest, watersheds, and wildlife habitat, and also creating a positive economic effect on forest-dependent communities. One of the manifestations of this vision was these 10 elements of sustainable forestry. Out of these guiding principles arose an organization called the Institute for Sustainable Forestry, which in turn created one of the first ecological forestry certification programs, Pacific Certified Ecological Forest Products. Inspired by the success of organic agricultural certification, the concept of certifying responsible forestry and forest products had taken root in the late 80s and early 90s, resulting in a number of seminal initiatives around the world. The core idea was to start with a standard that defines what constitutes good forestry. Supposing that all forest management takes place on a quality scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being the worst and 10 the best, let's say for the sake of argument that this standard represents 7.5 or better. Then, you audit forestry operations against the standard and give the ones that meet it the right to label their products as certified. If markets can be developed for the green label, then theoretically landowners who practice responsible forestry will be rewarded, and those who don't will have reasons to improve. This is the theory of change that underlay the founding of the first global forest certification system, the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, in 1994. FSC was created with the participation of many environmental groups, along with forward-looking companies, representatives of indigenous peoples, and those of many other stakeholder groups. The Institute for Sustainable Forestry's pioneering forest certification program for the Redwood region was subsumed into the FSC in the coming years. Forest certification was both a manifestation and a driver of the turnaround in forestry in the Redwood region, but there are many other dimensions to the change. There have been legal innovations. Organizations like the Pacific Forest Trust pioneered the development of working forest conservation easements, enabling private landowners, large and small, to receive tax breaks and other incentives for committing to conserve their forests and manage them responsibly. Conservation easements run with the land, so these commitments are binding and permanent. Other approaches to fostering change are based in policy. During this general time period, people began working on how legislation regulating greenhouse gas emissions, cap and trade, and carbon markets could be used to support restoration forestry. Both conservation easements and carbon credits address the challenge of how to underwrite forest restoration efforts financially when most of the valuable timber is gone, and it will be many decades before this changes. Then there's the nuts and bolts practitioners. There are those who have spent years honing techniques for managing degraded forests toward a healthier condition. There are others who have focused on restoring streams damaged by past logging, controlling erosion, recreating the conditions conducive to fish spawning and the survival of baby fish, and ultimately bringing back the salmon and trout. Finally, a significant and, to my mind, rather remarkable aspect of the transition has been a much-needed change in the practices of large industrial forestry operations in the region. One can view this change as being driven largely by necessity given the widespread depletion of saleable timber. But it can also be seen as part of a larger social awakening to the need to move away from the destructive exploitation of resources and toward stewardship and sustainability. To illustrate this, let's return to Louisiana Pacific and Pacific Lumber in the next chapter in the story. After LP put its Mendocino timberlands up for sale in 1997, the property was bought by an investment group controlled by the Fisher family, whose patriarch founded the clothing retail chain Gap. The new company was named Mendocino Redwood Company, or MRC, and its management soon announced that they were going to make a break from the past. Instead of overcutting, they promised to harvest less timber than grew annually in order to increase the volume and quality of standing trees over time. Instead of logging the few residual old-growth trees, they pledged to protect them. There were other commitments as well: protection of endangered species, erosion control and stream restoration, reduced chemical use, and the elimination of aerial spraying. MRC sought and received FSC certification in 2000. Noting that they were the largest landowner in the country to obtain FSC stamp of approval to date, MRC's president argued that it was critical to show success under the new regime since the rest of the industry would be watching. But LP had poisoned the well of community relations, and many Mendocino residents and activists strongly doubted that MRC would walk its talk. Not only that, they challenged both MRC's claims to be practicing sustainable forestry, as well as the integrity of FSC certification. Initially, in fact, conflict escalated when veterans of the struggle with LP led a multi-year campaign that called for a consumer boycott of Gap and its other brands, Banana Republic and Old Navy, organizing protests at stores across the country. MRC, however, did take steps in the right direction, bringing on a chief forester with years of experience responsibly managing redwood forest in the Santa Cruz Mountains, reducing the level of timber harvest, partnering with a number of local groups in slope stabilization and streambed rehabilitation initiatives, and, for the most part, eliminating traditional clear-cutting. As this quote illustrates, some began to credit the company for its good behavior. Around the time that it got certified, one environmentalist told a local reporter, quote, "Mendocino Redwood is the best company operating in Mendocino, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties. They're the first people who offer the promise of commercial forestry that's going to do things right. And in the meantime, they have to have some logs." MRC turned away from clear-cutting in favor of a selection system of forestry where individual trees or small groups of trees are harvested. Let's take a brief aside to define some key terms related to forest management. Individual and group selection and related practices are referred to collectively as uneven-aged management because they result in stands with a full variety of native tree species and age classes. There are significant ecological benefits associated with this management approach, such as better habitat for many birds and animal species, higher levels of carbon sequestration, and protection of forest soils. However, uneven-age management is widely considered more complicated and costly than even-age management, where trees are harvested through one of a set of techniques resulting in large stands that are the same age and height. The best known, and also the most popular, economically profitable, and controversial example of even-age management is, of course, clear-cutting. In the U.S. today, clear-cutting is almost always followed by the replanting of a commercial tree species and multiple applications of herbicides to suppress competing growth. Where done intensively, repeatedly, and at a large scale, clear-cutting is often referred to as industrial forestry, and establishes and perpetuates extensive monoculture tree farms instead of ecologically complex and biodiverse natural forests. Conflict between environmentalists and MRC has abated since the early years, but there is one area that has always been and remains a major point of contention, and that is herbicide use in tan oak. Tan oak is a hardwood species that is native to the coastal redwood forest, but it normally occurs in small proportions relative to the conifers. Tan oak, however, is a hardy pioneer that can outgrow redwood and Douglas fir in the first years after an area of forest is cleared. In the normal course of events, conifers would eventually outstrip the tan oak and come to dominate the forest canopy. But if large areas of land come to be overgrown and crowded with tan oak, as can happen if clear-cutting isn't followed closely by replanting, then it can impede the conifer's recovery and slow the forest transition to the next stage of ecological succession. According to MRC, about half of LP's lands was dominated by tan oak when they bought it. The company has long contended that it has to use herbicides to reduce the tan oak component of their forests because alternative methods are too costly. They justify removing tan oak by pointing out that it is part of their quest to manage their forest toward a balance of species more resembling that which preceded LP's 20 years of liquidation logging, and will eventually be phased out altogether. There are also strong economic reasons for MRC to establish redwood and Douglas fir in the place of tan oak. Unfortunately for them, or any other landowner whose forests are dominated by the tree as a result of past logging, today the only real market for the wood is firewood. Early on, MRC tried to make a market for tan oak lumber by manufacturing and selling tan oak flooring, but after losing a lot of money, they gave up. So, to hasten the growth of timber that can eventually sell, MRC embarked on a program of tan oak suppression. The herbicide that MRC is mostly used to kill tan oak is called imazapyr. It is applied by cutting through the bark of the tan oak tree and injecting a small quantity of the chemical into the plant tissue, a practice called hack and squirt. MRC maintains that the amount of imazapyr it uses is small, about 2.5 cups per acre, and that it is one of the safer chemicals suited to their goals. However, the company's critics counter that there is risk both to public and ecological health, and that removing tan oak reduces the amount of water in the soil, thereby impeding conifer recovery. Further, they charge that the large number of standing dead tan oak trees on MRC's lands, estimated to be as high as 15 million trees spread over 90,000 acres, poses significant fire risk. FSC prohibits the use of several of the most toxic forest chemicals, but does not ban imazapyr. a fact that only serves to confirm some people's poor opinion of the certification system. The fight over MRC's imazapyr use continues to rage to this day. In spite of this controversy, there is evidence that MRC has moved the dial in the right direction. A decade after it was formed, the company reported that its stocks of redwood and Douglas fir trees had increased by more than 25%. They claim that an investment of $11 million in sediment and erosion control has kept almost 1 million cubic yards of sediment, the equivalent of 100,000 dump trucks, out of streams and rivers. Whether one accepts these self-reported facts at face value or takes them with a grain of salt, it appears that MRC is making progress, and certainly no one argues that they aren't a lot better than what went before. MRC's track record was a factor in a later acquisition that represented another milestone in the history of the redwood industry. As noted earlier, Pacific Lumber Company filed for bankruptcy in 2007. A Texas bankruptcy court considered several reorganization options in 2008, but settled on a bid from the owners of MRC. They settled with Palco's creditors and took possession of its assets, the most significant of which being 210,000 acres of forest land, in July of that year, renaming it the Humboldt Redwood Company, or HRC. Palco's clashes with environmentalists had continued right up to the end. There were several tree sits and old-growth groves slated for cutting at the time that the change in ownership took place. MRC announced that it would extend its policy not to log old growth to HRC. Its chief of forestry personally communicated the promise to the tree sitters, and down they came. Also, HRC promised to reduce harvest levels to about 55 million board feet per year, compared with as much as 250 million board feet a year in the 1990s, and to obtain FSC certification for its forest lands as well. The news media trumpeted the possibility of a new era in the North Coast redwood industry. As one activist said, there was, quote, this amazing sense almost of, the war is over. Green Diamond is another dominant player in the redwood industry that is changing with the times. Second in size to the combined holdings of HRC and MRC, Green Diamond owns about 400,000 acres of land in Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties. More than 70% of Green Diamond's lands are managed as tree farms, even-age stands that are clear-cut in patches every 50 years or so. In 2013, Green Diamond followed in MRC-HRC's footsteps and got FSC certified. But unlike those companies, Green Diamond is continuing to clear-cut, albeit in 15-acre parcels with retention of patches of older trees to promote biodiversity and soil stabilization. Green Diamond also is maintaining forest buffers around waterways, including smaller streams, as you can see in this image, and taking measures to monitor and protect wildlife that the law does not require. Obviously, even-age management is allowed under FSC standards, a fact that has further diminished its reputation in some quarters. Before you include that FSC is bogus, however, consider the fact that its standards require substantial improvements over California's forestry regulations. As was previously noted, these, in spite of obvious flaws, are still the strongest in the nation. Also, it's critical to compare the forest practices allowed under FSC to the far more intensive industrial forestry certified by its main competitor, the Industry-Backed Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI. Going counterclockwise from the photo on the upper left, the SFI-certified operations seen here are located in the Sierra Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and Nova Scotia. It's also worth noting that Pacific Lumber was SFI certified from 2001 until 2007 when they went bankrupt. This difference is part of why major environmental groups in North America and around the world continue to support FSC. Even though it's not perfect, unlike SFI, it raises the bar on status quo forestry that hugs the regulatory floor. While it's undeniable that tensions between environmentalists and industry are less than they were, it's not like everyone is holding hands and singing Kumbaya. In 2014, for example, environmentalists blocked roads and climbed trees on HRC lands in the Mattole watershed, saying that the company's definition of old growth was too narrow and would allow logging of stands that they were determined to protect. Still, the days of extreme polarization and conflict between environmentalists and industry seem to be receding into the past. While MRC, HRC, and Green Diamond are going above and beyond the law in many areas, they are still businesses bent on making money, and this leads them to harvest their commercial conifers when they are relatively young, between 50 and 80 years old. This is because of something called the time value of money. Basically, when a company invests money in timber, it effectively chooses not to invest that money elsewhere. Money invested in, say, stocks and bonds will earn interest or pay dividends on a regular basis. Investment in trees, on the other hand, will have to wait decades to generate a return. Their capital is tied up for such a long period of time that it is a deterrent to even longer-term forest investments, such as allowing trees to grow old. All this is to say that there are powerful financial incentives to harvest timber on shorter cycles. Many advocates and practitioners of ecological forestry, however, argue that truly restorative forestry requires allowing trees to get much older than a half-century and manage depleted forests towards an old-growth condition. This entails not only selection forestry and uneven age management, but also a willingness and ability on the part of landowners to defer profits farther into the future. A significant challenge is finding ways to generate enough current income to let the land rest until timber volumes increase to the point where sales cover costs and then some. Proponents of this approach cite a number of benefits. Among others, older trees and soils that are not exposed by even-age management sequester more carbon and do more to combat global warming. Older forests are more ecologically complex and provide habitat for the greatest number of species. Older trees produce the best quality wood, and if the landowner is patient, this type of forestry will eventually produce more income than short-rotation forestry. There are numerous examples where forest landowners in the Redwood region are pursuing such a model of deep green forestry, probably into the hundreds of thousands of acres. If MRC, HRC, and Green Diamond are high up on the quality scale relative to the rest of the country, these operations are even higher. One example that is notable because it embodies many of the change drivers I mentioned earlier. A non-profit organization called the Redwood Forest Foundation, or RFFI, and the USAL Redwood Forest in northern Mendocino County. RFFI's mission is stated here. Quoting from their website, their vision is to, quote, establish community-based forests that provide both critical habitat for increased biodiversity and improve regional economic vitality. RFFI's first acquisition was a roughly 50,000-acre forest purchased in 2007. This forest had been heavily logged over by previous owners and was in a similar condition to the lands MRC bought from Louisiana Pacific a decade earlier. Watersheds were severely damaged. Most of the mature, high-value redwood and Douglas fir was gone. About 40% of the forest was tanno. Also, past clear-cuts were aerially reseeded with Douglas fir, resulting in numerous stands so overcrowded with trees that none can grow well. In these conditions, 60-year-old Doug fir trees that would normally be 24 inches or so in diameter are only about a quarter of that size, and these small diameter trees have no economic value. The purchase of the USAL forest was financed by a $65 million loan from Bank of America. To service this debt, particularly through the initial period when timber harvest must be limited in order to allow the forest to recover, RFFI had to be creative. It turned to several innovative ways of generating income touched on earlier in this presentation. First, RFFI established a conservation easement with the nonprofit Conservation Fund. The fund pays RFFI for abiding by the terms of the easement. The California Department of Forestry monitors the forest annually to ensure compliance. Second, RFFI is seeking to generate income through the sale of carbon credits. The market for these credits was established by groundbreaking climate legislation, the California Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. This law requires California to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. Among many other things, the law required the creation of a cap-and-trade program that requires utilities, large industrial plants, and fuel distributors to buy carbon credits from registered carbon projects like the USAW that sequester carbon. Another way that RFFI is generating income is through the production and sale of biochar. This is charcoal that is used for biological ends as opposed to heat, most commonly as a soil amendment. RFFI bought a biochar machine in 2013. Subsequently, they conducted a demonstration in which they broke even, and they expect to turn a small profit as production is increased. One major benefit of biochar is that it creates a saleable product from tan oak and might underwrite the costs of tan oak thinning. Unfortunately, all of these strategies put together do not produce enough income for RFFI to service its debt. So, as one would expect, they are bridging the gap by cutting and selling what merchantable timber they have. Some are concerned that the debt is pushing them to cut too much and to use overly aggressive methods. RFFI intends to reduce the level and lighten the touch of their timber harvest as their inventory grows and the quality and value improve. In an interview, RFFI's president summed things up, saying, quote, "The challenge is how to buy time to let the forest recover until there is enough timber for the forest to pay its way." While the USAW is an inspiring model of restoration forestry, there are some who contend that in order to bring back the old growth, you have to go even farther, reducing the rate of annual harvest well below the 2.9% limit set by RFFI's conservation easement to as low as 1%. They contend that higher rates of harvest may be sustainable in terms of yield, but that you will still be maintaining a relatively young forest. And this is not truly restorative because it doesn't allow the forest to develop old-growth characteristics. One of the people taking this position is a fellow named Raul Hernandez, whose commitment to restoration forestry goes back more than 20 years. In an interview, Raul argued that, quote, "You have to be willing to leave more of the money in the woods, to let the trees grow older and produce quality wood. People are willing to pay a huge premium for dense grain old-growth redwood. Timber companies should manage for a higher quality product and sell it at higher margins," end quote. Raul has demonstrated this by creating a business, Forever Redwood, that manufactures and sells high-quality redwood tables, seating, pergolas, and pavilions. Here's a final example of restoration forestry in the Redwood region that is quite interesting, and this is work that is taking place in Redwood National Park and the Headwaters Reserve. Many people aren't aware that large areas of both were logged before they were protected. Tens of thousands of acres of Redwood National Park and 65% of Headwaters' 7,500 acres were clear-cut. In both places, managers face a similar problem as in the USAW. Too many trees too close together, all competing for water, light, and nutrients, severely inhibiting their growth and the progression of the forest to the next stage of succession. To illustrate the point, this picture is of a second-growth forest in the Headwaters Reserve with an average-size ecologist for scale. Believe it or not, these trees are several decades old. As one would expect, restoration of these areas requires a massive thinning program. This involves a practice that is called thinning from below, taking out the smaller trees to reduce the number of trees and increase the spacing between those that are left, allowing them to develop the canopies necessary to capture the water and sun to grow. Here is the same area of forest before and after thinning. Drawing toward conclusion, I want to share some salient excerpts from an interview with a fellow named Rob DePerna. Rob works for the Environmental Protection Information Center, or EPIC, in Humboldt County. EPIC was a key actor in the battle with Pacific Lumber pretty much from beginning to end. In our interview, Rob described himself as, quote, "kind of a dinosaur, a dying breed. When I first started being a forest activist in the late 90s, there were a lot of people who knew a lot about forestry, But as time has gone on, the circumstances have changed. Now there's few people like me. In the present day, Rob continued, one of the challenges that EPIC and other organizations like Save the Redwood League are confronting is, the old growth is sort of saved. What do we do with the other 95% of the landscape that's been logged over? He told me about the restoration efforts at Redwood National Park and Headwaters, and then exclaimed, "It is so counterintuitive for people like me to think that forestry as a management tool is the answer to previous forestry." The transformation of forestry in the Redwood region is remarkable and unique. Many hundreds of thousands of acres of damaged forest lands are being logged and restored at a scale that has no equal anywhere else in the country. Over 80% of California's working redwood forests are now FSC certified and are being managed to a higher standard than ever before. The poet W.H. Auden once wrote, "A culture is no better than its woods." After a century and a half of depletion and degradation, Northern California's woods and the surrounding culture are starting to heal.